Welcome back, everyone, to our Traveling Through History series. Today, we're going to continue reading from Richard Holmes The Napoleonic Wars. And we're going to start today with Chapter 3, Artillery. A gunner by training, Napoleon affirmed that great battles are won by artillery, and paid particular attention to its use, especially that of his belles filles, the 12-pounders which he sought to mass against the crucial point of his opponent's position. The artillery Napoleon inherited had suffered less than other arms from the purges and immigrations which accompanied the Revolution. In the 1760s and 1770s, French artillery had been reorganized according to the system devised by Jean-Baptiste Vaquet de Gribeauval, with standardized 4, 8, and 12-pounders, 6-inch howitzers, carriages, ammunition wagons, and tools. Gribeauval introduced elevating screws instead of wedges and accurately made barrels and ammunition, which ensured that shot fit snugly, enabling propellant charges and thus barrel weights to be reduced without loss of range. Siege artillery was heavier, for its balls had to penetrate the squat ramparts that then characterized fortification. Mortars whose explosive projectiles were fired at a high angle were primarily used in sieges. The 4-pounders were regimental pieces, assigned to the infantry. And in 1804 to 1805, as part of a change of equipment to the system of the year 8, Napoleon replaced them with captured 6-pounders. These proved too heavy and led to the brief abandonment of regimental artillery. It was reintroduced in 1809, but all the regimental pieces were then lost from the retreat from Moscow and were not replaced. The same year 8 reforms increased the proportion of 12-pounders and brought a 24-pounder howitzer into service. By 1813, Napoleon sought to have a ratio of 5 guns of all types for every 1,000 men in his army, but this was never achieved. Gun detachments varied from the 8 trained gunners and 7 assistants serving the 12-pounder to 6 and 4 men respectively. For a 4-pounder, a gun was loaded by having its barrel swabbed to extinguish smoldering residue from the previous charge. A cartridge, black powder contained in fabric, was inserted into the muzzle and rammed home, and a projectile followed. Often cartridge and projectile were united to form a fixed ammunition. One of the detachment poked a pricker into the touch hole to pierce the cartridge, and inserted a firing tube of fine gunpowder. The weapon was aimed, and was fired by having a port fire, a length of smoldering quick match on short staff, applied to its touch hole. The recoil hurled the gun backwards, and the detachment, using hand spikes and ropes, hauled it back into position before the process recommenced. A 12-pounder might get off 1 round a minute, with lighter pieces managing 2 or maybe even 3. Napoleonic cannon fired 4 sorts of projectile. Most common was the iron round shot, whose weight defined the piece. The 12-pounder ball was 11.7 centimeters, or 4.6 inches in diameter. It had a maximum range of some 1,650 meters, or 1,800 yards. Canister or case shot had numerous balls contained in a tin container, which burst at the cannon's muzzle. A 12-pounder light canister contained 112 balls, and the heavy version had 46 larger ones. The heavy canister of a 12-pounder could reach out to 550 meters, or 600 yards. Common shell, the preferred projectile for howitzers, was an iron globe filled with powder ignited by a fuse. Fuses were unreliable, making it dangerous to fire over one's own troops. And shells often burst into a few large pieces, which limited their lethality. A type of British shell called shrapnel or spherical case contained musket balls as well as a bursting charge, and was intended to explode in the air above its target. Carcass, also fired from howitzers, ignited to produce illumination or to set fire to combustible targets. Foot artillery, whose gunners marched alongside their horse-drawn pieces, and which accompanied infantry formations, might achieve 15 to 25 kilometers, or 10 to 15 miles a day. Horse artillery accompanied cavalry, and the gunners were all mounted on ammunition limbers or on horses to maintain speed. Although Napoleon's artillery was rarely decisive on its own, there were times when its concentrated fire shook opposing infantry so badly as to render it incapable of resisting a French onslaught. This was Napoleon's plan for Waterloo, his last battle, and had the ground been firm enough to permit him to get his great battery of 84 12-pounders into action sooner, the fortunes of the day might have been different. We will now enter Chapter 4, the Italian Campaign. In the aftermath of Vendemiaire, Napoleon was promoted to the General of Division and appointed Commander of the Army of the Interior, but his real interest lay in Italy. Here the French and Austrians were in sharp contention, and he repeatedly criticized Schere's conduct of operations there, inducing the Directory to give him command of the Army of Italy, replacing Scherer in March of 1796. The strategic plan had been established by Lazare Carnot, the engineer officer and mathematician turned Republican politician and strategist. France, assailed by numerous opponents, had to carry the war into enemy territory, and Carnot planned to use 5 field armies to fight a coordinated campaign in southern Germany and northern Italy. In late March, Napoleon reached Nice and assumed command of a threadbare army with just 37,000 effectives. He was 26, and some senior officers attributed his appointment to politics, thinking that his recent marriage to Josephine Beauharnais, former mistress of Paul Barras, was part of the plot. Napoleon lost no time in disabusing them. He jabbed forward and beat the Austrians at Montenotte on the 12th of April, but heavy fighting in the middle of the month was inconclusive. He regrouped, and on the 21st of April, took the well-stocked arsenal at Mondovì from the Piedmontese, persuading them to seek an armistice and freeing him to deal with the Austrians. Napoleon crossed the River Po by sending Massena and Sourières to fix Austrian attention on Valenza, while the rest of the army lunged eastward to cross at Piacenza. Beaulieu, the Austrian commander, was shaken by the speed of the advance and fell back towards Cremona. On the 10th of May, Napoleon caught his rear guard at Lodi, on the river Adda. Milan fell 5 days later, and the spoils of the city enabled Napoleon to pay his army in cash for the first time. Napoleon had to deal with risings in Milan and Pavia before pushing Beaulieu along the shores of Lake Garda and gaining possession of the whole Lombard plain. The powerful fortress of Mantua, however, held out, and French communications were stretched thinly across the recently conquered territory. At this juncture, Wurmser arrived with Austrian reinforcements, collected Beaulieu's scattered forces, and advanced on Mantua, down both sides of Lake Garda. Napoleon was in real trouble, with outlying detachments driven in and lines of communication cut. He had to raise the siege of Mantua. However, Augereau checked the Austrian advance at Castiglione on the 5th of August, enabling Napoleon to concentrate and defeat Wurmser's main body. Napoleon again besieged Mantua, and then, moving at lightning pace that characterized the campaign, triumphantly outmaneuvered Wurmser, who found himself blockaded in Mantua. In November, the Austrians committed 2 more armies under Dalvinci and Davidovich to a 2-pronged attack, but Napoleon, now at the very height of his powers, jinked around Dalvinci's flank, secured the crucial bridge over the Adiga at Arcola, and won a 3-day battle on the 15th and 17th of November that sent the 3rd Austrian counteroffensive reeling back. Duly reinforced, Dalvinci tried again, but was beaten at Rivoli on the 14th of January 1797, and Mantua surrendered on the 2nd of February. Napoleon now faced a fresh army under the Archduke Charles, but had reached the Semmering Pass, from where his advanced guard could glimpse the spires of Vienna, when an armistice was agreed in April. Though Napoleon's conduct of the campaign was not perfect, he had excelled in concentrating at the decisive point, and his personal courage, vital energy, and inspirational words had made him the army's darling. It was a stunning debut. we will now enter into Chapter 5, Infantry. The infantrymen made up the most numerous component of any Napoleonic army, trudging the roads in rain or shine, and often deciding battles by the fire of his musket or the shock of his bayonet. Most French foot soldiers carried the 1777 pattern flintlock musket or its war production 1793 version. To load it, the soldier taught the process in 21 drill movements. Bit open a paper cartridge, keeping the round lead musket ball in his mouth. He trickled some powder into the priming pan and snapped the steel shut on top of it. Then he put the remaining powder into the muzzle, spat the ball on top of it, and rammed in the cartridge as wadding. To fire, he brought the musket up to his shoulder, thumbing the cock back as he did so. When he pressed the trigger, the cock shot forward, the flint gripped in its jaws, hit the steel, striking a spark that ignited the powder in the pan, and flashed through the touch hole to fire the weapon. But sometimes the flint would not spark, or the touch hole was blocked by residue. Men had to replace flints and use a picker, hung from a crossbelt or button, to unblock the touch hole. In heavy rain, priming pans got soaked. On the Katzbach in 1813, in the rain, 3/4 of the muskets would not fire. A trained soldier could fire 3 rounds in a minute, but for a line of infantry, this might fall to 4 rounds in 3 minutes. Musketry was effective against a large target at 100 meters or 110 yards, and dangerous at 200 meters or 220 yards. Bullets might carry up to 500 meters or 550 yards, but at this distance they rarely killed. Rifles whose grooved barrels gave them better range and accuracy, but a slower rate of fire, were carried by some skirmishers. In 1789, there were 101 French regiments of infantry with royal or regional titles. After the Revolution, these became numbered, and in 1793, they were abolished in favor of 198 demi-brigades, each with 3 battalions, 1 from the old army and 2 of volunteers. Numbered regiments, 90 line and 27 light, replaced demi-brigades in 1803, and by January of 1813, there were 169 regiments, 133 of infantry of the line, and the remainder light. Although light infantry paid special attention to skirmishing, the practical difference between these and line regiments diminished. Detailed organization varied, but a regiment, commanded by its colonel, contained 2 to 4 battalions, each under its chef de bataillon. Typically, a battalion might have 6 center companies and 2 elite companies, a grenadier company and a light company. Grenadiers, the biggest and bravest men, could spearhead an assault or advance at the rear to buttress the faint-hearted. The light company contained the best shots, who often skirmished ahead of the battalion, using cover and firing independently. A company, in theory comprising 120 men, was commanded by a captain, with a lieutenant and a sous-lieutenant. 2 to 4 regiments formed a brigade, and 2 or more brigades, often with a battery of artillery, comprised an infantry division. According to the 1808 organization, a battalion numbered 834 men, plus a small battalion staff. In practice, however, a battalion's field strength early in the campaign was usually around 600, reducing as the campaigns wore on. In 1811, in Portugal, for example, Massena's battalions averaged around 350 men. Training was based on the regulation of 1791, which emphasized the methodical execution of drill movements. 18th century theorists had debated the relative merits of the line, which maximized firepower, and the column, the most expeditious means of moving troops cross-country, and which gave the best chance of breaking the enemy's line by physical and psychological shock. The immigration of many officers and the arrival of poorly trained volunteers meant that French infantry of the 1790s had little chance of adhering to the drill book, but instead showed a natural aptitude for advancing in column, preceded by swarms of skirmishers, whose fire might unsettle the enemy and enable the column to put in a bayonet charge. Later, various forms of ordre mixte with part of a unit in line and part in column, were widely used. It is not true to assert that the British always fought in line and the French in column, although their 2-deep line, in contrast to the 3-deep line of most other armies, did enable the British to make best use of their available manpower. Wellington showed particular aptitude for sheltering his lines behind crests of hills or ridges, so that attacking French columns were often subjected to accurate close-range fire with little warning. One colonel told the author Stendhal that in 3 years his regiment had put 36,000 men through its ranks. It was difficult to produce sufficient trained officers and NCOs. In 1811, Napoleon complained that he had found a sergeant with less than a year's service and 19 corporals with under 2. Repeat the order that no NCO will be appointed without 3 years' service, he wrote. Some infantry sent to Russia in 1812 did not understand how, when skirmishing, to use the rise and fall of the ground, but instead maneuvered mechanically. And as standards declined, generals often responded by using huge columns that maximized control and cohesion. In 1814, one general could only move his troops in mass when the officers and file closers could keep them formed up. And with that, we will end today's episode. Tune in next time, where we will enter into Chapter 6, Egypt and Syria. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.